Hello, everyone. Welcome on this talk on things I learned while growing as a UX designer. I'm Stéphanie Walter, and I'm a UX researcher and UX designer, and I live and work in Luxembourg. For the last almost 12 years now, I've worked for a web agency, a university, and as a UX consultant on different projects from automotive industry to European institution, banks, investment companies. And I kind of specialize in enterprise UX. So complicated businesses, a lot of tables and a lot of data is something that I actually enjoy quite a lot designing those days. A little bit more about how I actually became a designer. So I've always been kind of a creative person. I was drawing a lot, and I was also kind of a geek. So I was also really soon into computers and playing around with computers. So I discovered there was a master degree that you could do in Strasbourg that was called CAWeb, which is a mix between foreign languages and web design. And the kind of easiest way to enter this master degree was to do a bachelor in foreign languages. So I ended up doing a bachelor in foreign languages, where I've started taking already some Photoshop classes. I learned HTML and CSS as well. And then I did this master degree with a whole semester in Germany, where I studied again things around web design and stuff like that. So I finished my master degree, and after that we were supposed to find a 6-month internship, and I chose to go back to Germany, and I did my internship in Germany. So I worked as an intern, and the company really liked my work, so they hired me after that. So my first job was kind of in-house product and UI designer. It wasn't called like that. It was Grafikerin, something in German. But yeah, to translate in those today's terms, it would be product and UI designer for a company in Germany. So the first things I learned really quickly is just because you're out of school, that doesn't mean you stop learning. And I think this is the first lesson and kind of the most important one at some point. And I also think this is why I'm still happy in the field of design, is because you learn every day. You learn new methods, you learn new tools, and also you learn a lot about your users and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of the fun part. It's also a little bit the scary part at some point, I think, because it also means that you need to keep a little bit up to date as well. So this can be kind of a little bit stressful sometimes as well. Then the other thing I learned really quickly at that time also is it's never too early to start building a network. I would say if you're a student and you just arrive in the tech industry, even if you're not a designer, if you go into development, project manager, whatever, start building a network as soon as possible. And when I'm saying building a network, I mean quality over quantity. Don't just like add anybody on LinkedIn and don't follow up, things like that. Try really to find people you can rely on, people you can mentor you, because this is one of the things I think I was missing when I started earlier, is I didn't really have anyone I could ask design question to. I was kind of a only junior designer in my company, so it was a little bit complicated. So I would say attend conferences, attend meetups. At the moment, there's a lot of things that is still going on online, which means there's no more barrier regarding travel and things like that. So it's actually a great time to do networking as well. And then again, quality over quantity. Try to like build a relationship with people, talk to them, and don't just like add them, and that's it. So I had a lot of fun in Germany, but after 2 years, I came back to France, and I worked for a small web agency, and I was a UI and a UX designer for them. So I was still doing a little bit of HTML, CSS when I arrived, but I stopped coding really quickly to concentrate fully on design and usability. So I became kind of the UX expert. in the company. In French, we call this ergonomie. So the cool part is I was working for an agency, is you don't really get bored. You get to work on a lot of different projects, and since I love learning, and I'm a really curious person, it was really a lot of fun to discover new areas and new clients and things like that. So I actually learned a lot about a lot of different businesses that I had no idea even existed before that. So the first lesson I kind of learned there is always ask why. We have this saying as a UX designer, which is ask people 5 times why. And there was this really fun infographic that was on LinkedIn, which was what's the common point between a UX designer, a 5 years old child, and what's this band name in and a famous boys band, and it was like the why, like ask me why. So yeah, that's kind of the biggest tool that we have in this actually digging further with asking why, because people are not usually really good at explaining to you what they need. So by asking why again and again and again, you kind of go beyond their first solution. So I had these clients, and we were building a website to help them teach music to students. And at some point, he wanted to have a feature in the website where the students can send an email to the teacher. And it was an MVP, really low budget. So he said, yeah, but we really did this feature, and we need to keep the archives on the website. So we did a big, how would you say that? Kind of a big space on the server for the archives, which is really complicated. It takes a lot of time, money, but also if you have archives of conversation, there's some laws about that in France. It was before GDPR. I think GDPR covers that today as well. But there was a lot of stuff involved there. And then my developer started like inquiring how can we keep so much data on a server, things like that. And then I asked the client, but like, why do you need to keep those email on the server? I said, yeah, because then the teacher can go back to those, refer to in case there's a problem or a disagreement with a parent or something like that. It's like, yeah, but then why do you want it on your website? And it's like, yeah, what do you mean? It's like, you need a way to keep those emails somewhere, but it doesn't have to be on your website. Why? Right? So what we did at this time as again an MVP was, instead of going through the whole hassle of having to keep those exchanges on the server and all of that, what we said is, okay, when they're going to send something to a student, there's a little checkbox that you can check, and then this is going to send a copy of this email into their own mailbox. So instead of developing something super complicated, just by asking why and really understanding the client need, which was a place to store the emails, what didn't have to be our website, then we were able to make this kind of a first version of that for a lot less of time regarding development, but also a lot less of cost for the client. This was like 6 years ago, maybe even 7 years ago. So in France, it was a little bit complicated. I feel it still is for UX designers to sometimes being able to actually access users. There's a lot of project where you're asked to do the design, you're trying to do your best, but at some point the client is going to block you from talking to the users, or is not going to provide the users. So what happens is a lot of people get a little bit discouraged, especially again junior, when they arrive in a web agency where they thought they would do user interview and user testing and things like that, and they end up really never talking to the users. So I agree it's discouraging, but I would say it tends to get better more and more as the maturity of design grows inside the industry. So my first tip is, don't get discouraged. It's changing slowly. But also there's kind of indirect methods to collect user data, even if you're not, again, allowed to talk directly to users. So there's a few kind of indirect research methods I want to talk to you. So the first one is there's a lot of papers that are actually done in a human-computer interaction fields. So you have a lot of literature reviewed. So it can be interesting, for instance, if you're doing some research and you don't have access directly to users, to start by looking at what's the prior research that was done in different fields. And maybe this should give you already kind of a first way to go. So I was doing some research with dyslexic students on how we might help the school bring them better learning, but also exam conditions. And what I did is I didn't have access at the beginning of this project to dyslexic students. So what I did, I checked the research, and there was a lot of interesting things done in Sweden on this topic. So I was able to already start working on that just by using a little bit of literature review. Another thing you can look at if your firm has an analytics is to get some quantitative data from there. So it's not perfect, but it's a start to know what pages are the most viewed, where do people go, where do they leave your website, things like that. So all of this kind of quantitative data, often if you have a client that is interested into SEO, they might have one of those tools. It can be Google Analytics, Matomo, and a few other ones. So this is also another place where even if you don't talk to users directly, you might still be able to gather some data. And if you don't have an analytics, you can be smart. You can maybe ask the dev team about the server logs. So this is what we have on my current project. The old tool doesn't have any analytics, but at least we have some server logs. So we're checking the server logs to understand if this page was viewed a lot or not, in order to help us prioritize the research and which pages shouldn't be migrated. I also worked for another client, and it was a booking plane ticket website. And again, we didn't have detailed analytics on some of the things, but I checked the URL and the parameters were inside it. So I asked the developers, since we were recording all the URLs that were open, to give me some data on the different parameters to be able to understand what is the things that people search the most. So even without having this kind of super specific analytics, just by talking to the dev team and understanding what do they have on their server log, you might be sometimes able to gather some information about users. Then there's some tools that you can install on the website. There's a session replay tool like Full Story and Hotjar. So again, such tools won't let you talk to the user, but you are able to replay like a small little movie what they were doing on the website. We used that one on a client who wanted us to work on redesigning the whole onboarding process, so the whole creating an account. And by watching those small little recording, what we saw is that a lot of clients, when they were asked to give their credit card number while creating this account, they would either completely close the website, or what they would do is they would search somewhere on the page for an FAQ or for information. So we understood just by watching those that people didn't understand why they had to give their credit card number while creating an account. There's a reason for that, for this specific client. And what we did is basically we changed the whole flow. And next to the credit card number, what we did is we added some information about why do we ask it that early in the process. And this made it better. Apparently, a lot of more people finished the Senate process. Then if you're working on a tool like software as a service tool, things like that, where you have support team, those people usually are kind of the front line, the ones user will complain to, user will go to when there's a problem with something. So usually everywhere when support has amazing databases of with a lot and a lot of information, email, things like that, where they have all of this data about what's the main pain points for users and things like that. So again, if you don't have direct access to users, you might go to support and ask for data. Their data can be something interesting as well. Then you could do a survey. I'm not a big fan of survey as research method because there's so many ways to build a bad survey. And when you build a bad survey, then you start working with poor data. But still, if you don't have the choice, often marketing teams, they run a lot of survey on existing user databases and things like that. So if you don't have anyone else, you can maybe get closer to marketing, ask them if they already have some information about the users, but also if maybe at some point you can add a few questions for your research in surveys they are going to launch anyway. And then again, if you're a product that is online, there might be a lot of places online where people will give you their feedback. So if you're a native app, for instance, you can take a look at what are people saying on the different stores, so iOS, Android, things like that. Even better, you might be interested into seeing what are people saying about your competitors. Because it's really, really nice to build a good product, but it's even better if you're able to build a product that is going to solve the needs of your users before the competitors. So this is always why I'm often interested about what people say about the product that we build, but also about what are they saying about the competitors. So another thing I started doing while working in France for a web agency is giving conferences, giving talks, and teaching. And I was scared. My first talk, someone had to drag me almost to stage. So I was already writing some article, but yeah, my first talk was really, really very scary. But it taught me a lot because I had to research the topic. So I even learned while preparing the talk, which is usually why I prepare talks on new topics, is so that I can go a little bit deeper into a topic. And for the teaching, it's the same. Like having to explain to someone to something is kind of the best way to learn so much about a topic. Also, it's amazing because usually, like my students have super interesting questions about tools and methods that I took for granted. I'm like, I do that because I was taught to do that way. But yeah, you're actually right. Like maybe there's another way, or why do we even do it like that? So there has to be a good reason for things like that. Especially when I was teaching CSS, for instance, I had to search really, really deep into some of the specification to be able to explain it to my students as to why we do something like that. So it's always really cool because it usually forces you to rethink your own methods and your own workflow by just like being able to teach it. So after a few years in France, I decided to switch country, and I accepted a job offer in Luxembourg to work at the university. So up until now, my UX skills were mostly acquired through reading, practice, a lot of book articles, but also conferences. And I saw this as a great opportunity to actually get more scientific and maybe a little bit more academic in my UX research practice. So what I learned at the university is that many of the tools and the methods that you use for user research when you build native applications or websites, so digital UIs, can actually be used beyond digital UI. And for instance, we were building a collaborative learning space for students. So actual physical spaces in the library for the students so that they could do different things from a debate space to a research space and a lot of other different spaces. And what we did is we apply a user-centric method to that. We did a lot of workshop with students. We did workshops with teachers as well. And we did some prototypes. So part of the prototyping the space was having this little map of a space and asking students what they expected as tools, as softwares, as also furnitures, things like that. So we asked basically the students to draw the spaces they had in mind for their dreams. And then there was a prototyping of the actual space. So kind of a fake space, as to say. So yeah, a lot of the tools that we use as digital designers, they can be used for going kind of way beyond that and going across more like services and things. Then I don't know if it was because I was already working for 5 years in the industry by that time, or if it was because I had amazing colleagues and I knew I could count on them. But it's also when I started understanding that as long as I have a solid plan, I know I can improvise and it's going to be fine. So adaptability and resilience is a skill that is super important for designers. And it's silly, but it used to freak me out. Like I was like, oh, but what if something goes wrong in this workshop? Or, oh, but what if? And so today I still do super detailed plans whenever I do research, whenever I do workshops, whenever I do anything, I have a solid plan. But I also know that at some point we are not gonna stick to the plan. Uh, some activities in the workshop will take longer. Some activity might not work because the people were not too much into this activity, while some other activities that you thought were going to be just an icebreaker, something quite small at the beginning, might take a lot of time, but then you will learn a lot from this activity. So for me, it's always having a plan, always preparing the timing, but also being super flexible about that. At the end of the day, as long as when it's finished, you gather the data you need to design the thing you're supposed to design, it's going to be fine. And again, this used to be really complicated for me because I prepared these plans and I was like, okay, but we said to the client we are going to do that and that. What happens if we don't do exactly what was in the plan? So it took me a lot of time to kind of give up a little bit of control, but it also gets a little bit better, I think, once you have a great team to work with and you have a kind of more self-confidence into your capabilities to improvise whenever something goes wrong. Then after that, I went back to the private sector and I worked in a small design team for a consulting company. So usually consulting companies in Luxembourg, they send the designers and the developers directly to the clients. Here we had a small design studio within the company and I had to do kind of two main tasks. I was half-time working for a startup as a as a product designer. And the other half of the time, I was working on different clients and helping developers whenever there was some design needs on some of the other projects. There, I learned that roles and responsibility of UX design or of design is often needs to be defined. It's a little bit complicated, but not a lot of people actually understand what UX designers do. Especially in Luxembourg, a lot of companies are really tech-driven IT company. And until a few years ago, in a lot of really tech and IT-driven environments, the people who talk to the users, air quotes, are business analysts. So when I arrived on some project and was like, yeah, I'm gonna talk to the users and do some wireframes, people would tell me, well, no, we have a business analyst. He already did that. He went, he asked a few questions, and here are the wireframes. I was like, okay, what again? What am I supposed to do then? And this kind of generated a lot of conflict with not only the business analysts, but also for some project because some of the clients wouldn't understand all of a sudden why the designer wanted to kind of redo the wireframe of or redo the work of a business analyst. So this is why I'm saying roles and responsibilities needs kind of often to be defined upfront to make sure everyone is on the same page. So after that, what I started doing is whenever there was a business analyst on the project, I was really candid with them. I went to them, it's like, okay, look, I usually do that, and that. I work like that. Can you explain to me how you work, how usually what you do? And then we can find a way to best collaborate. So kind of a not formal way of defining role and responsibilities. But still, so this is really important. Otherwise, you end up with, again, like people being frustrated, not understanding why you're kind of redoing the work of someone else, and a lot of conflicts within the teams. Another thing is that UX design is not about making things pretty. Yet, this is kind of really hard to understand for other people. Again, especially in super development driven environments. So when I was working there, I had a lot of developers who would come almost like 1 or 2 weeks before the project went to production and say, "Oh, the client is complaining that is ugly. Can you please make it a little bit more pretty, like put some paint on it because the client is complaining and I'm not happy about that." And again, this is super frustrating. Your inside designer is screaming, is crying, wants to throw stuff at this poor developer. It's not even her fault, but still. But yeah, so what I used to do is usually I use that as an opportunity to explain to those people a little bit more about UX design. So we ended up accepting making things pretty, sadly, on a lot of projects, but we also kind of use that to push a little bit further the design team. So on one of those projects, we were hired to make it prettier, let's say, at the end of the project, but I was able to negotiate with the client that even if we were going to make it a little bit prettier, we would still work a little bit on the usability of the interface, and we would test the design. And I was super surprised, but the client actually accepted. So we didn't do the user research. We just made it better by using heuristics that are well known to different designers. And then we tested it, and actually it tested pretty nicely. We did a few rounds of back and forth, modified the design a little bit, but still, by accepting to kind of make it pretty, we were still able to sneak in some usability testing at the end of the project. And something really cool happened with this client. She had another project, and I think she came back to us 6 weeks after that. And she said, "Oh, look, like the usability testing you did in at the end of the project, you told me we could do that even earlier, even before it was developed. Can we do that for the next project?" I was like, "Yes, we can." Actually, that's even better. If we test the design instead of testing the developed thing, it will cost a little bit less money. So yeah, people not understanding that design is not just about making things pretty is a little bit kind of frustrating sometimes, but at the same time it can be an interesting opportunity to start having conversation with clients, with developer teams, and maybe little by little bringing them to kind of a more understanding position where they might come back later for a new project where you will be able to do more research and more tests and things like that. So, as I mentioned previously, consulting company often sends designer directly to the client, and this is what I'm doing today. So today I'm working as a UX researcher and design and consultant. So I work for a different client, and it's more like usually long-term mission. And the big difference between what I do today and what I used to do is today I'm integrated directly into the teams of my clients. So I go there. So at the moment, I go there virtually. We're still working remotely, but I'm like full-time working for one single client. I'm with their dev team, with their tester, with the scrum master, and within the whole team. So I'm kind of integrated into the whole agile team. And today I work for an investment bank. And my work as a designer looks something like that. So this is mostly a lot of work as a researcher, actually. So we are redesigning this super big tool, almost used by everyone in the bank. And we have a lot of users who have a lot of different needs, and all of them are using the same tool. So it's super interesting. It's also super challenging because, as I said, many people, many different needs. So it can be a little bit tricky sometimes. And it means that today I still do a lot of things. So we are doing this whole quantitative analysis I showed you before with server logs. We are doing interviews to understand what people are how they're using the current tool. So we're doing both interviews, but also actually task observation. So we ask them how they do something, and we usually ask them to share their screens so that we can take a look, things like that. So there's a lot of research. There's also a lot of prioritization based on different user needs. We have a ton of content and features to migrate. It's been kind of a more than 3-year project now, and we don't migrate everything at the same time. So there's also a lot of things around hierarchy and how do you make sure that you bring all the different features in the right orders. And there's the design system I'm working on. So I'm doing a lot of things, and I kind of enjoy being inside a team and working on one single project for now. We'll see in a few years if it's still the case, but it's quite different from agency, because in the agency, as I said, you usually jump from one project to the other. Here, it's more like you see the project on the whole cycle, and you have different releases where you will see actually the things that you designed are going to production to the users. So it's kind of another way of working than agency. Both have kind of advantages and disadvantages, depending on if you prefer to have different topics and jump from one to the other to not get bored, or if you really want to follow one being project from the beginning to the end. But then some people don't like that because they get bored by the topic, or they don't enjoy the topic that much. So for me, for now, I actually enjoy working like that. So as a consultant, I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. So depending on the client and depending on who you work with, either you get a lot of respect because you're a consultant and you're considered as an expert in your domain. So people in some company tend to listen more to consultants. And then in some other companies, you're an external one, so your voice isn't as strong as the internal people. So there's no way to know this in advance. So if you're ever going to be a consultant, be careful about that. It's kind of 50-50. Sometimes you're the superhero who can save a project, and sometimes you're just a resource and you're just here to do your stuff and they don't really listen to you. I've been lucky so far. I've been more on the expert side, and people listen to me. Also, I can be a little bit noisy sometimes, so I kind of find ways to nicely force them to listen to me. But yeah, it can be a double-edged sword. For I know a lot of designers who are frustrated because they're stuck in the your voice doesn't matter that much as an external, and they usually end up switching client or becoming an internal person, so getting hired directly to work by the client. There's also different levels of maturity of design and UX design in different company, and there's this kind of magic wand myth around UX design. So usually it starts with hostility towards design. Kind of, yeah, we don't need design, it's an internal tool, we just need to make it work, and that's it. And often what happens is there's a project somewhere in the company that has a designer for some reason, and this project gets a huge success. And all of a sudden, in the company, people start associating the word design or using UX design with something that magically makes project better. So what happens at this stage of maturity is they start recruiting more designers, but often they kind of have no idea what those people are supposed to do. So it's kind of it's a weird area to be sometimes. And this is when you hear things like, oh, can you give me some tips to make this more UX? It's like, what? Yeah, I want it to be more UX. You mean user friendly? Yeah, something like that. Can you give me tips on where I should put the buttons? Like, yeah, but this is going to take a little bit of time to understand project and things like that. Or, oh, your job looks easy and fun. How can can you recommend me a few books so I can do it myself? I was like, yeah, again, it's a real job, so I can recommend you books, but you might lack kind of the years of experience to do something like that. So The thing is, again, this can be frustrating. Like people don't really understand how it works, why it works. And often this happens because people don't see the whole process. They kind of understood that sometimes at some point, some people did some interview, talk to the users. So we have one end, and then they see the good stuff, the super easy interface that is built. And everything in the middle is a black box. So my kind of advice here is if you can make the process clear to people, like don't be afraid to show the steps in between, show maybe the mock-ups that didn't make it to the final decision, and don't just like build this black box around the work of a designer, because otherwise people might just think, yeah, okay, it's kind of magic something. So yeah, if you want to have kind of a growing maturity, we also need to make people understand how a whole design process is working and also how they can participate into that. And this is deeply linked to this point, which is turning developers, but not only developers, I would say anyone in the team, into design allies usually make your life so much easier as a designer. So we have all those jokes around, yeah, designers don't liking developers and developer hating designers, because we always come up with something that they can't technically do, and designer always hate when the developer are killing the really nice mock-up that we built. So I try to avoid these kind of cliches, and I really try to build stronger relationship with my dev team, especially in an agile environment. And there's a few things that you can do. The first is attending the developer meetings. There's a lot of, especially if you're into agile, there's a lot of ceremonies around those, like dailies, you have weekly meetings, things like that. And often it's quite interesting to attend those. So if you want people to listen to you at some point, you also need to understand how they work, and it's back end or front end. So it can be interesting to attend the developer meetings. Also, what I do is, as I said before, I try to not work in this kind of hidden way, and I give them actually a lot of information about the user research. So most of the time when we're doing research, we give them a small summary of what was discovered, so that they understand why we're doing this. Why do we build this way? Why is this data here? Why is the button here? Why is the navigation at the top not going to be sticky? Because there's reason linked to the user needs on that one. I also usually bring them what we call verbatim, which is direct quotes from users. Um, I'm the lucky one. I get all the compliments. I also get all the complaints, but I get the compliments. So when things work nicely in a usability session, I have nice verbatims like users saying, oh, this is an amazing feature. This is going to make my life so much easier. So it's really, really nice because I get to hear those. But I also think it's really important to, again, bring those compliments, bring those great things to the developers, to the BA, to the testers who actually helped build these tools. So a lot of things that I do is whenever we have nice session, I give them some verbal teams. I bring them those interesting user feedback so that they understand that, yay, your work matters, you are doing something great and people are actually happy, and this is what they're saying. Because I think it's important to kind of involve the people in the team into all of those design and UX topics. And then I do a lot of documentation for the designers, for the developers, but also for the designers. So we are building a design system, and we are building a lot of style guides to make sure that first we have consistency, but also because, again, it will help developers build the app so it looks things like that. So we document a lot of things like the colors, like how it's supposed to work. And usually it's better for them, when I discuss with developers, to get detailed design than having a super complex story and have to read a lot of text and things like that. So this is also why I'm trying to have like developers as allies, is by bringing them kind of doing a little bit the extra steps to document things, so that I'm trying to make their life as a developer a little bit easier. I also think that some deliverables that I use as a UX designer to that help me actually build the things are things that can help the dev team. So as a UX designer, what I do is I build task flows, which are those little diagrams with little boxes that are showing me how is someone going to accomplish a task in an interface. So how are they going to navigate? What happens when they click here? They go there. Then there might be a branching. Do they have an account? Yes, no. If they don't have an account, we end up in the flow where they create an account. If they have one, then. So it can become quite complex. And usually this kind of things helps dev teams a lot because then again, they understand the logic behind all of those screens. I also discovered that my tester loves that, like my QA quality assurance person. He has to write tests, automated tests, and he really finds those super useful. So I'm like, again, I have this graphs that detail how it's supposed to work. Let's share those with the teams because clearly this is something that will help them. And then again, on the right here, we have a screen flow, which is kind of the same as a task flow, but instead of having abstract little boxes, I actually put the real screens. And again, this is kind of the super useful documentation that is going to help my team understand what happens when you click on a button, where does it go, and small details like that. Then I'm also a big fan of show don't tell. So when we have prototypes, so I'm building the prototype for usability testing, but again, the prototype can be super helpful to help people understand how you're supposed to navigate in something, especially when they have interactions and already transition between pages, things like that. So this is a prototype made in Axure. And it's already pretty advanced because you have, as I said, you have some scrolling. You can see that things move from left to right to left with animation transitions and stuff like that. So what I do is also I add the prototype directly to the tickets so that, again, they can play around with the prototype and understand a little bit better what is expected in terms of interaction and in terms of how things are supposed to how pages are supposed to be linked between each other. And last but not least, I want to say that can be a mentally exhausting job. Really, as a designer, we have to deal with a lot of things, and I know a lot of designers who went on burnout because they did too many hours, because we are passionate people, because it's really hard to stop sometimes. It's also sometimes a little bit hard to get a distance between the work and work life and private life, and I think it got a little bit worse with the COVID situation, with working remotely. So I think it's important to be kind to ourselves and take breaks and try to put some self-care things first. UX designer is a field where you talk to a lot of people. We work with human beings. Most UX designers, they have a background in psychology or HCI. And it's beautiful to work with human beings, but it can also be complex. And sometimes it can also be distressful depending on in which area you work. If you work in health tech, for instance, you might, you use the research, end up with topics that might be a little bit complicated. I worked on some tools that were supposed to help elderly people. So I wasn't expecting to have some of the conversation I had with the doctors during the interviews, and honestly, at the end of the day, it was a little bit tough for me. So I don't think anything can prepare you to have complicated conversation. But this is why I'm saying at some point you need time to rest. You need time to take breaks. Usually when you talk to people, you're trying to find pain points. So if you start trying to understand how things are going in a company because you want to improve the maturity, you might end up being the one who listens to everyone saying how awful the thing might be. So again, kind of heavy topic can happen, and this is why we need to be careful as UX designers, because at some point it's a little bit too easy, I think, to get caught up in the work and burn out. But it's also what I like about this job is there's a lot of human interaction involved, and also it's something that never stops to move, as I said. I've never worked on the same project twice, and I think that's also the interesting part. But the fact that it's moving all the time, that there's always a new trend, always a new method, always something new, especially with a lot of articles and everything, again, it might be super scary for some people. So it's great to learn, but it's also great to take some pauses and to take care of yourself. That's my last advice. So I hope you learned something from what I've learned during those almost 12 years as being a designer in the tech industry. And thanks for attending this talk.